Imagine standing in a desert valley nearly 12,000 years ago. There are no nations, no kings, no written language, no pyramids rising toward the sky, no great empires stretching across continents. Humanity is still emerging from the long shadow of the Ice Age. Most people live as hunters and gatherers, moving from place to place in search of food and water. And yet, in one remarkable location, something extraordinary is happening. A settlement is beginning to take shape. Not just a temporary camp, not just a collection of huts, but a place where people are choosing to stay. A place that many historians and archaeologists believe may be the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth. That place is Jericho. Located in the Jordan Valley, near the Jordan River and north of the Dead Sea, Jericho sits in one of the most historically significant regions on the planet. Today it appears as a modest city, but beneath its streets lies layer upon layer of human history. Each layer represents a different era. Each era represents a different civilization. And together, they tell a story unlike any other. Because Jericho wasn't merely a city, it was a witness to the birth of civilization itself. For thousands of years, people have been fascinated by Jericho. Some know it from ancient religious texts, others know it from archaeology, but few realize just how astonishing its story truly is. The question is simple: how did a city emerge at a time when cities weren't supposed to exist? To answer that question, we must travel back to a world completely different from our own. A world where survival was never guaranteed. A world where humanity stood at the edge of a revolution. And at the center of that revolution stood Jericho. To understand Jericho, we first need to understand the world in which it was born. Around 12,000 years ago, Earth was changing dramatically. The last ice age was coming to an end, and Jericho became one of their greatest achievements. What started as a small settlement gradually expanded. More families arrived. More houses were built. The population increased. For the first time, humanity was experimenting with something that would forever change the course of history: permanent community life. Most people imagine civilization beginning with famous places like ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. But Jericho predates them by thousands of years. Think about that. When the pyramids were built, Jericho was already ancient. When the first pharaohs ruled Egypt, Jericho had existed for millennia. When the earliest cities of Mesopotamia flourished, Jericho was already old. This realization forces us to rethink our understanding of civilization. Because civilization didn't suddenly appear. It evolved gradually. And Jericho offers a rare glimpse into those earliest stages. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that around 9,600 BCE, the settlement was already thriving. People lived in circular houses constructed from mud bricks. They stored food. They shared resources. They organized community activities. Most importantly, they remained in one place. This may not sound revolutionary today, but at the time, it was unprecedented. Humanity was learning how to live together on a larger scale than ever before, and that required entirely new ways of thinking. People needed systems for cooperation, rules for sharing resources, methods for resolving conflicts, strategies for protecting the community. In essence, they were laying the foundations for everything that would later become civilization. Then came one of Jericho's greatest mysteries, a structure so remarkable that it continues to puzzle researchers today. A massive stone tower, discovered during archaeological excavations. The tower dates back approximately 10,000 years. That makes it one of the oldest large-scale stone structures ever built by humans. Imagine the challenge. No metal tools, no walad baiklas, no advanced engineering equipment. Yet somehow, the inhabitants of Jericho constructed a stone tower standing nearly 30 feet tall. The structure required tremendous labor. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of tons of stone had to be moved. Workers needed organization. Planning was essential. Leadership was necessary. This wasn't the work of a small family. It was a community project, and that fact alone reveals something extraordinary. The people of Jericho were capable of coordinating large groups toward a shared goal. That level of social organization was revolutionary. Some researchers believe the tower served defensive purposes. Others suggest it had ceremonial significance. Still others argue it may have functioned as an early astronomical marker. The truth remains uncertain, and that's part of what makes Jericho so fascinating. Every discovery seems to raise new questions. The tower stands as a reminder that ancient humans were far more sophisticated than we often imagine. They weren't primitive people stumbling through history. They were innovators, builders, problem solvers, visionaries, and they were accomplishing things that would shape the future of humanity. Even more astonishing than the tower was another discovery: a massive stone wall. For decades, historians believed city walls emerged much later in human history. Jericho challenged that assumption. The wall surrounded part of the settlement and represented one of the earliest known examples of large-scale defensive architecture. Why would people need a wall? Were they protecting themselves from enemies, wild animals, floodwaters? The debate continues. Some experts suggest the wall functioned primarily as protection against seasonal flooding. Others argue it served military purposes. Regardless of its exact function, the wall demonstrates something crucial. The people of Jericho were thinking long-term. They weren't merely surviving from day to day. They were investing time and energy into infrastructure. They were planning for the future. And that mindset would become one of civilization's defining characteristics. For the first time in human history, large groups of people were creating permanent solutions to long-term challenges. The wall was more than a physical structure. It was a symbol of humanity's transition from wandering bands to organized communities, a symbol of the birth of urban life, and perhaps most importantly, a symbol of a future nobody could yet imagine. Because Jericho's story was only beginning, the settlement would survive droughts, invasions, climate changes, and countless generations. Empires would rise and fall. Kingdoms would appear and disappear. Entire civilizations would vanish into history. But Jericho would remain, waiting, watching, enduring. As Jericho continued to grow, something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface of daily life. The people who lived here were not only building homes, they were building beliefs. Every civilization is shaped by what its people think about life, death, family, and the unseen forces around them. Long before temples dominated landscapes, and long before priests ruled over kingdoms, the inhabitants of Jericho were developing traditions that reveal a surprisingly complex view of the world. And some of those traditions would leave behind one of the most mysterious archaeological discoveries ever found, a discovery involving human skulls. When archaeologists excavated ancient Jericho, they expected to find houses, tools, and pottery. They found those things, but they also uncovered something far stranger. Buried beneath the floors of ancient homes were human remains. At first, this wasn't entirely surprising. Many ancient cultures buried their dead close to where they lived. But then researchers noticed something unusual. The skulls had been removed. In some cases, they had been carefully preserved. Even more astonishing, the faces had been reconstructed using plaster. Shells were inserted into the eye sockets. The result was both fascinating and unsettling. These plastered skulls looked almost alive. For decades, scholars debated their purpose. Why would people preserve the heads of the dead? What role did these skulls play in Jericho's society? Many experts now believe they were connected to ancestor worship. The people of Jericho may have believed that their ancestors remained important members of the community even after death. By preserving their faces, they kept their memory alive. Perhaps family members gathered around these skulls during ceremonies. Perhaps they believed the wisdom of ancestors continued to guide the living. No one knows for certain. But one thing is clear: these were not simple people living simple lives. Their beliefs were sophisticated. Their rituals were meaningful, and their culture was becoming increasingly complex. While spiritual traditions evolved, another revolution was transforming Jericho: agriculture. Today, farming seems ordinary. We rarely think about it. Food appears in stores. Markets are filled with products from around the world. But agriculture may be the single most important invention in human history. Before farming, human populations remained relatively small. Groups moved frequently. Food supplies were unpredictable. Everything depended on nature. Then something changed. People began planting crops intentionally. They discovered that seeds could be saved, planted, and harvested. This simple idea changed everything. Jericho became one of the earliest places where this transformation occurred. The fertile land surrounding the settlement allowed people to cultivate wheat and barley. For the first time, large food surpluses became possible. And once food surpluses existed, civilization could expand. More food meant more people. More people meant more specialization. Not everyone needed to hunt or gather anymore. Some could become builders. Others could become craftsmen. Others could focus on leadership, religion, or trade. Civilization was beginning to take shape. And Jericho stood at the center of that transformation. As centuries passed, Jericho grew larger. What began as a small settlement gradually expanded into one of the most significant communities in the region. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of people may have lived there during certain periods. That may not sound impressive compared to modern cities, but in the ancient world, it was extraordinary. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds or thousands of people when most humans elsewhere still lived in small groups. The challenges were immense. Food had to be distributed. Conflicts had to be resolved. Resources had to be managed. Cooperation became essential. Jericho was becoming a laboratory for human society. The lessons learned here would eventually influence countless communities across the ancient world. In many ways, Jericho represented humanity's first attempt at large-scale urban living. And despite the difficulties, it worked. For generations, for centuries, for millennia. As Jericho prospered, its inhabitants discovered another powerful force: trade. No community possesses everything it needs. Some regions have valuable stone. Others have metals. Others have fertile farmland. Trade allows people to exchange resources and ideas. Evidence suggests that Jericho became part of an expanding network of exchange. Archaeologists have found materials that originated far from the settlement. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used for tools, appears to have traveled hundreds of miles. Other goods arrived from distant regions as well. This tells us something remarkable. Even in prehistoric times, people were connected. The ancient world was not isolated. Ideas moved. Goods moved. People moved. And Jericho became an important hub within those growing networks. Every trade route brought new knowledge, new technologies, new customs, new opportunities. The city was becoming increasingly sophisticated, and its influence continued to expand. Yet history is never a straight path. Success often attracts new challenges, and Jericho was no exception. For thousands of years, its people had benefited from favorable conditions. But nature can be unpredictable. Climate shifts affected the region. Rainfall patterns changed. Resources became less reliable. Periods of drought threatened agriculture. Suddenly, survival became more difficult. Some settlements elsewhere disappeared entirely. Others were abandoned. Communities that had flourished for generations collapsed. Jericho faced the same dangers. Yet somehow it endured. Its freshwater spring continued to provide a lifeline. Its people adapted. They adjusted their farming practices. They strengthened their community structures. And they survived challenges that destroyed many of their neighbors. This resilience would become one of Jericho's defining characteristics. Again and again throughout history, the city would face adversity. Again and again, it would recover. The most fascinating aspects of Jericho is what archaeologists call a tell. A tell is a mound created when successive generations build new settlements on top of older ones. Imagine a city being destroyed or abandoned. Years later, new people arrive. They build directly over the ruins. Centuries pass. Another settlement emerges on top. This process repeats over and over. Eventually, a massive artificial hill forms. Jericho's archaeological mound contains layer after layer of human history. Each layer tells a different story. Each layer preserves evidence from a different age. Together, they create an extraordinary record spanning thousands of years. Few places on Earth offer such a continuous timeline. In some sections, archaeologists can literally move through history by digging deeper. Every foot downward represents centuries of human experience. The deeper they dig, the further back in time they travel. And each discovery reveals another chapter in Jericho's incredible story. As generations passed, the origins of Jericho gradually faded from memory. Children grew up hearing stories from parents. Parents learned stories from grandparents. But after thousands of years, who could remember the beginning? Who could remember the first builders? Who could remember the people who raised the ancient tower? Who could remember the community that first chose to settle beside the spring? The city became older than living memory, older than legends, older than written records. Its true beginnings disappeared into prehistory. Yet the city remained. While countless settlements vanished forever, Jericho endured. Empires would come. Empires would fall. New languages would emerge. Religions would spread across continents. Powerful kings would rise and disappear. But Jericho would continue standing through all. By the time Jericho entered the age of recorded history, it was already unimaginably old. Generations had come and gone. Entire cultures had risen from the earth and disappeared back into it. The people living in Jericho could never have imagined that their city would one day become one of the most famous places in human history. Yet that is exactly what happened. Because Jericho was no longer simply a settlement near a spring. It had become a strategic prize, a gateway, a crossroads connecting powerful regions of the ancient Near East. And wherever valuable land exists, powerful rulers eventually arrive. Around 3000 BCE, humanity was entering a new era. This was the Bronze Age, a period defined by growing cities, expanding trade networks, organized armies, and increasingly powerful rulers. Across the ancient world, civilizations were flourishing. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, great cities were rising. In the Nile Valley, Egypt was becoming one of history's greatest civilizations. Meanwhile, Jericho continued to occupy a crucial position within regional trade routes. Caravans moved through the region. Merchants exchanged goods. Ideas traveled across vast distances. The city benefited from these connections. Its population expanded. Its defenses improved. Its influence increased. Archaeological evidence shows that Bronze Age Jericho became a heavily fortified city. Massive defensive walls surrounded the settlement. Powerful towers protected entrances. The city was clearly preparing for threats, and those threats were very real. The ancient world was often a dangerous place. Competition for resources could lead to conflict. Cities fought for territory. Kings sought wealth and power. Armies marched across landscapes that had once belonged only to farmers and shepherds. Jericho stood directly in the path of these historical forces. Generations had come and gone. Entire cultures had risen from the earth and disappeared back into it. The people living in Jericho could never have imagined that their city would one day become one of the most famous places in human history. Yet that is exactly what happened. Because Jericho was no longer simply a settlement near a spring. It had become a strategic prize, a gateway, a crossroads connecting powerful regions of the ancient Near East. And wherever valuable land exists, powerful rulers eventually arrive. Around 3000 BCE, humanity was entering a new era. This was the Bronze Age, a period defined by growing cities, expanding trade networks, organized armies, and increasingly powerful rulers. Across the ancient world, civilizations were flourishing. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, great cities were rising. In the Nile Valley, Egypt was becoming one of history's greatest civilizations. Meanwhile, Jericho continued to occupy a crucial position within regional trade routes. Caravans moved through the region. Merchants exchanged goods. Ideas traveled across vast distances. The city benefited from these connections. Its population expanded. Its defenses improved. Its influence increased. Archaeological evidence shows that Bronze Age Jericho became a heavily fortified city. Massive defensive walls surrounded the settlement. Powerful towers protected entrances. The city was clearly preparing for threats, and those threats were very real. The ancient world was often a dangerous place. Competition for resources could lead to conflict. Cities fought for territory. Kings sought wealth and power. Armies marched across landscapes that had once belonged only to farmers and shepherds. Jericho stood directly in the path of these historical forces. To understand why Jericho mattered so much, consider its location. The city sat near important trade routes connecting different regions. Anyone controlling Jericho could influence movement throughout the area. Water sources made it even more valuable. In a dry environment, reliable fresh water was a strategic advantage. As kingdoms expanded, places like Jericho became highly desirable. Control of the city meant economic opportunities. It meant military advantages. It meant political influence. As a result, Jericho repeatedly found itself caught between competing powers. For centuries, rulers sought to dominate the region, and every new conflict left its mark upon the city. Some periods brought prosperity, others brought destruction. But throughout it all, Jericho remained remarkably resilient. Again and again, it recovered. Again and again, people rebuilt. Again and again, life continued. No discussion of Jericho can avoid one of the most famous stories ever associated with the city, the story of the walls. For thousands of years, this account has captured imaginations around the world. According to ancient tradition, Jericho possessed formidable defensive walls. These walls appeared nearly impossible to overcome, yet the city eventually fell. The story became one of history's most enduring narratives. Naturally, archaeologists became deeply interested. Could physical evidence confirm what ancient traditions described? Excavations conducted during the 19th and 20th centuries attempted to answer that question. The results sparked intense debate. Researchers discovered evidence that Jericho's walls had indeed experienced destruction during various periods. But determining exactly when specific events occurred proved far more complicated. Dating ancient ruins is challenging. Different archaeological teams reached different conclusions. Some findings appeared to support traditional timelines. Others suggested alternative interpretations. Even today, scholars continue discussing the evidence. What everyone agrees upon, however, is that Jericho experienced multiple cycles of construction, destruction, and rebuilding throughout its long history. Its walls rose, its walls fell, and new walls often replaced the old ones. The reality may be even more fascinating than any single story. Jericho survived for so long precisely because it adapted continuously. Each generation inherited challenges from the previous one and responded in its own way. As centuries passed, another great power extended its influence into the region. Ancient Egypt. At its height, Egypt controlled vast territories beyond the Nile Valley. Pharaohs sought resources, trade routes, and political dominance. Jericho became part of this larger geopolitical world. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence showing connections between Jericho and Egypt. Artifacts reveal trade relationships. Imported goods demonstrate cultural interaction. The city was no longer an isolated settlement. It had become integrated into an international network stretching across the ancient Near East. Imagine standing in Jericho during this period. Merchants speaking different languages pass through the city. Exotic goods arrive from distant lands. News from powerful kingdoms spreads along trade routes. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected, and Jericho sits at the center of many of those connections. Eventually, the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age. New technologies emerged. Iron tools became more common. Military tactics evolved. Political landscapes shifted dramatically. Throughout these changes, Jericho continued adapting. Different groups occupied the city at different times. New rulers arrived. Old powers disappeared. The region became a mosaic of cultures and influences. This constant change is one reason Jericho fascinates historians. The city acts almost like a time capsule. Each archaeological layer captures a different chapter of human history. One layer reflects Bronze Age society. Another reveals Iron Age culture. Another preserves evidence from later civilizations. Together, they create an unparalleled record of humanity's journey through time. As centuries turned into millennia, some of history's greatest empires emerged. The Assyrians expanded across the Near East. The Babylonians built powerful kingdoms. The Persians created one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Later came the Greeks, then the Romans. Each empire left its mark on the region. Each introduced new ideas, technologies, and systems of government. Yet something remarkable happened. Despite all these changes, Jericho survived. Not always as a great city, not always as a powerful center, but it endured. The same spring that attracted settlers thousands of years earlier continued flowing. The same oasis continued supporting life. The same location continued drawing human communities. Civilizations changed. The landscape of power shifted, but Jericho remained. This persistence is perhaps the city's greatest achievement. By the time the Roman era arrived, Jericho was already ancient beyond comprehension. Imagine living during the reign of a Roman emperor and visiting Jericho. To those people, the city would have seemed incredibly old. Its origins stretched back farther than most could imagine. In many ways, Jericho was already a monument to history itself. Travelers passed through. Scholars wrote about it. Rulers recognized its importance. The city became woven into the broader story of the ancient world. Yet beneath their feet lay secrets they could never fully understand. Buried deep underground were traces of humanity's earliest experiments with civilization. The first walls, the first tower, the first generations who chose settlement over constant movement. Those pioneers had no idea what their decisions would ultimately create, but their legacy endured, and it still endures today. Thousands of years later, a new type of explorer arrived. Not conquerors, not merchants, not kings, archaeologists. Armed with brushes, notebooks, and scientific methods, they began peeling back the layers of Jericho's past. What they discovered transformed our understanding of human history. Every excavation revealed older structures, older communities, older evidence of organized society. Again and again, researchers pushed the timeline further back. The deeper they dug, the older Jericho became. Eventually, it became clear that this was not merely an ancient city. It was one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, because Jericho offers something extraordinarily rare. A nearly continuous record of human settlement stretching back close to the dawn of civilization. Few places can tell such a story. Even fewer can tell it so clearly. So, is Jericho truly the oldest city on Earth? The answer depends on how we define a city. Some scholars point to other ancient settlements. Others argue that Jericho's continuous occupation makes it unique. The debate continues. But perhaps that isn't the most important question. Perhaps the real question is this: what does Jericho teach us about ourselves? Its story reminds us that civilization did not appear overnight. It emerged slowly, one decision at a time, one generation at a time, one community at a time. Long before famous empires existed, ordinary people gathered beside a spring. They built homes. They raised families. They buried their ancestors. They cooperated with neighbors. They faced challenges and adapted. Without realizing it, they were helping create the foundations of the modern world. And that may be Jericho's greatest mystery. Not how old it is, but how deeply connected its story is to all of us. Because in many ways, the history of Jericho is the history of civilization itself. And after nearly 12,000 years, its story is still being uncovered. For most of human history, the true age of Jericho was unknown. People knew the city was ancient. They knew it appeared in historical records and religious traditions. They knew generations had lived and died there for thousands of years. But nobody realized just how far back its roots extended. The secrets of Jericho were hidden underground, buried beneath centuries of construction. buried beneath collapsed walls, abandoned homes, forgotten streets, and layers of dust accumulated over thousands of years. Then, in the modern era, archaeologists arrived, and what they uncovered would force historians to rethink the origins of civilization itself. When visitors first look at ancient Jericho's archaeological site, they often see what appears to be a large mound. At first glance, it doesn't seem extraordinary, but appearances can be deceiving. This mound, known as Tel Es Sultan, is one of the most important archaeological locations on Earth. Every layer within the mound represents a different chapter of history. Imagine stacking thousands of years on top of each other. One settlement is built. It eventually collapses or is abandoned. A new settlement rises directly above it, then another, and another. The result is a giant archive created not by historians, but by time itself. Each layer contains clues: broken pottery, stone tools, ancient walls, animal bones, seeds, human remains. Every object tells part of a story, and together they reveal how humanity evolved from small communities into complex societies. During the 19th century, European explorers became increasingly interested in the ancient Near East. Stories from historical texts and religious traditions inspired many expeditions. Researchers wanted to locate ancient cities and uncover their histories. Jericho quickly attracted attention. Excavations began, but archaeology at the time was still a young science. Early excavators often focused on finding spectacular artifacts. Detailed recording methods were not always used. Important information was sometimes lost. As a result, many questions remained unanswered. The city guarded its deepest secrets. For a time, it seemed those secrets might remain hidden forever. Then came a woman who would transform the study of Jericho. In the 1950s, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon arrived at Jericho. She was determined to apply a more scientific approach. Instead of simply digging for treasures, Kenyon focused on understanding the layers of history. Every layer mattered. Every fragment mattered. Every detail mattered. Her methods were meticulous. Workers carefully excavated narrow trenches through the mound. These trenches exposed the different layers like slices through a giant history book. For the first time, researchers could study Jericho's development in extraordinary detail. The results were astonishing. The deeper Kenyon's team dug, the older the settlement became. And older still. Eventually, they reached layers dating back nearly 12,000 years. This discovery shocked the archaeological world. Civilization, it seemed, had begun much earlier than many experts previously believed. Among the most remarkable discoveries was the famous stone tower. Even today, it remains one of Jericho's greatest mysteries. The tower stands roughly 8.5 meters, or nearly 30 feet high. It was built around 8000 BC. To put that into perspective, this structure predates the Great Pyramid of Giza by more than 4,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. It predates writing itself. Think about what that means. Human beings living at this time had no metal tools, no advanced machinery, no wheeled transport. Yet they somehow organized enough labor to construct a massive stone monument. Researchers estimate that thousands of workdays may have been required. The project demanded planning, leadership, cooperation, engineering knowledge. This wasn't the work of isolated families. It was the work of an organized community. And that realization changed how archaeologists viewed early humans. The people of Jericho were not primitive. They were capable of remarkable achievements. The tower raises one of archaeology's most fascinating questions. Why did people build it? Several theories exist. One theory suggests defense. Perhaps the tower helped protect the settlement from attackers. Another theory proposes flood control. Seasonal flooding may have threatened the community. The tower and surrounding structures could have helped manage water. But some researchers believe the answer may be even more intriguing. Astronomical observations suggest the tower may have aligned with nearby mountains and the setting sun during certain times of year. If true, the tower may have served ceremonial or symbolic purposes. Imagine thousands of years ago, villagers gathering to watch the sun disappear behind distant peaks. The tower, standing as a connection between earth and sky. A monument not merely to survival, but to belief. No one knows for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the tower so captivating. It reminds us that the ancient world still holds mysteries beyond our reach. Then there's the wall, one of the oldest large-scale stone walls ever discovered. The wall surrounded parts of the settlement and represented a remarkable engineering achievement. For generations, historians assumed that defensive walls emerged much later. Jericho challenged that assumption. The existence of the wall suggested that organized construction projects were already taking place during humanity's earliest experiments with settled life. But why was the wall built? Again, archaeologists disagree. Some argue it protected against floods. Others believe it defended against human threats. Perhaps it served both purposes. Regardless of its exact function, the wall reveals something important. The people of Jericho were thinking collectively. They were investing effort into protecting the community as a whole. That level of cooperation represents a major step in the development of civilization. One of the biggest challenges in archaeology is determining age. How do you know whether an object is 500 years old or 10,000 years old? This is where science becomes essential. Researchers use techniques such as radiocarbon dating. Organic materials contain tiny amounts of radioactive carbon. Over time, this carbon decays at a predictable rate. By measuring the remaining carbon, scientists can estimate an object's age. Seeds, charcoal, wood fragments, animal bones, all can provide valuable information. At Jericho, radiocarbon dating helped confirm the extraordinary antiquity of the site. The results repeatedly pointed toward the same conclusion. People were living here thousands of years earlier than many expected. These scientific methods transformed archaeology. No longer did researchers rely solely on historical texts. Now, they could measure time directly from physical evidence. The ground itself became a witness, and Jericho's testimony was remarkable. Among the most unforgettable discoveries were the plastered skulls. When archaeologists uncovered them, they immediately recognized their significance. The faces have been carefully reconstructed. Features were modeled with plaster. Shells often represented eyes. These were not casual burials. They reflected deliberate cultural practices. But what exactly did they mean? Many scholars believe they represent ancestor worship. Families may have preserved the faces of important relatives. Perhaps these ancestors were seen as guardians. Perhaps they served as symbols of identity and continuity. In a world without written records, memory mattered. The dead remained part of the community. The plastered skulls provide a rare glimpse into how early humans understood life, death, and belonging. They reveal emotional depth, spiritual complexity, and a powerful desire to maintain connections across generations. Before Jericho's discoveries, many experts imagined civilization beginning suddenly. Large cities appeared, governments formed, agriculture émerged, complex societies developed. Jericho revealed a different story. Civilization was not a single event. It was a process, a gradual transformation spanning thousands of years. The people of Jericho experimented with settlement. They developed agriculture. They organized labor. They constructed monuments. They created rituals. Step by step, they built the foundations upon which later civilizations would stand. This realization changed how historians view the human journey. The roots of civilization extend deeper into the past than anyone once imagined, and Jericho sits at those roots. Despite all these discoveries, questions remain. Was Jericho truly the first city? Or was it one of several early settlements evolving at the same time? What exactly defines a city? Population size? Permanent building? Social organization? Economic activity? Different scholars offer different answers. Some point to other ancient sites that may be equally old. Others argue that Jericho's continuous occupation makes it unique. The debate is ongoing, and That is part of what makes archaeology so exciting. Every new discovery has the potential to change our understanding. Every excavation may reveal another piece of the puzzle. The story is never completely finished. As the 20th century progressed, Jericho became more than an archaeological site. It became a symbol of humanity's earliest ambitions. A reminder that civilization did not begin with kings and empires. It began with ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Choices to settle, to cooperate, to build, to imagine a future beyond mere survival. Why did civilization begin at all? Why did humans abandon a lifestyle that had sustained them for tens of thousands of years? What drove our ancestors to create cities, governments, religion, trade networks, and eventually the modern world? If you strip away everything we associate with modern life, cities, nations, technology, laws, money, you're left with something very simple. Humans trying to survive. For most of our existence, that is exactly what we were doing. Not building empires, not constructing cities, not writing history, just surviving. So the question becomes almost shocking when you really think about it. Why did that change? Why did humans stop moving constantly as hunters and gatherers and begin building permanent settlements like Jericho? Why did we create civilization at all? For tens of thousands of years, humans lived in small, mobile groups. They followed animals. They gathered plants. They moved with the seasons. This lifestyle was not primitive in a negative sense. It was highly effective. It kept populations stable. It allowed flexibility. It required deep knowledge of nature. But around 12,000 years ago, something began to shift across parts of the world. Climate change. As the last ice age ended, temperatures rose. Rainfall patterns changed. Some regions became more fertile. Others became harsher. And in certain places, something rare appeared. Abundance. Where there had once been scarcity, now there was food in greater supply. And Jericho was one of those places. At the heart of Jericho's success was something simple but powerful. Water. The natural spring at Jericho created a stable, reliable source of fresh water in an otherwise dry environment. This changed everything. Where water exists consistently, plants grow. Where plants grow, animals gather. Where animals gather, humans follow. But unlike many other locations, Jericho's water source did not disappear seasonally. It remained steady. Year after year, generation after generation. This stability made something possible that had rarely been achievable before. Permanent settlement. Once humans realized they could stay in one place without starving, everything began to change. One of the most important developments in Jericho's early history was agriculture. Instead of simply collecting wild grains, people began to experiment. They saved seeds. They planted them intentionally. They observed which plants grew best. Over time, this process became more organized. Wheat and barley became reliable crops. Food production increased. And for the first time, humans were no longer completely dependent on unpredictable nature. This was not just an economic shift. It was a psychological revolution, because farming changes how people think about time. A hunter thinks in hours or days. A farmer thinks in seasons and years. A civilization begins to think in generations. Jericho was one of the places where this new mindset first took root. Agriculture created something that had never existed on a large scale before. Surplus food. Settled life changed how humans understood identity. Instead of belonging only to a mobile group, people began to identify with a place. A home, a land, a community that remained stable over time. This shift is subtle but powerful. It creates attachment. It creates tradition. It creates memory tied to geography. In Jericho, generations of people lived in the same region. They built on the same ground. They buried their dead in the same places. Over time, the land itself became part of their identity. This emotional connection to place is one of the foundations of civilization. Jericho as a human experiment. In many ways, Jericho was not just a city. It was an experiment, a long-term test of what happens when humans stop moving and start building. Could people live together in large numbers? Could resources be managed fairly? Could structures last across generations? Could societies organize themselves without collapsing? Jericho provided early answers. Not perfect answers, but real ones. It showed that large communities were possible. It showed that cooperation could scale. It showed that humans were capable of shaping their environment rather than simply adapting to it. And that realization changed everything that came after. The ripple effect across the world. Jericho was not alone in this transformation. Other early settlements were emerging in different regions of the world. In Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, in parts of Asia, in the Americas much later. But Jericho stands out because of its extreme age and continuity. It represents one of the earliest known steps toward urban life. And once that step was taken, there was no turning back. Ideas spread. Agriculture expanded. Settlements multiplied. Cities grew larger. Civilizations formed. Empires eventually emerged. And modern society became possible. All of this traces back to decisions made by small groups of people thousands of years ago. What Jericho really represents. When people think of Jericho, they often think of ruins, ancient walls, archaeological discoveries, or stories passed down through history. But Jericho represents something far more important than ruins. It represents transition, the moment when humanity began transforming the world instead of simply surviving within it. It marks the shift from movement to permanence, from survival to planning, from nature-driven existence to human-shaped environments. Jericho is not just a city. It is a threshold, a doorway between two different versions of humanity. Even after decades of research, Jericho still raises questions we cannot fully answer. We know when people live there. We know what they built. We know some of their rituals and tools. But we still cannot fully enter their minds. We cannot feel what they felt. We cannot fully understand their beliefs, fears, or dreams. We can only interpret fragments, pieces of pottery, broken walls, ancient skulls, layers of earth containing echoes of lives long gone. And yet, somehow, those fragments are enough to tell a story of innovation, a story of survival, a story of humanity discovering itself. Jericho forces us to reconsider what it means to be advanced, because the people who built it had no machines, no written history, no modern science, and yet they accomplished something extraordinary. They created one of the earliest known permanent communities in human history. They built structures that still astonish archaeologists today. They developed systems of living that would influence all future civilizations. In the end, Jericho is not just about the past. It is about us. Because every modern city, every road, every building, every system of society has roots that stretch back to places like Jericho. And those roots remind us of something simple but powerful. Civilization did not begin with greatness. It began with people choosing to stay.